Mary walked slowly out of the morgue carrying the sobbing Thomas in her arms. In one moment, he had lost his son and mother as well as any chance he had to escape his fate. Once the MVA case was closed, his identity as Bobby would be permanently established. It was plain to Thomas that Mary was mentally incapable of even considering that he was anyone other than her beloved baby boy. Marge's and Bobby's death had caused a psychotic break in her reality. No amount of evidence would convince her that her baby Bobby was dead. Like most people, she wanted what she wanted when she wanted it, and no amount of rational argument would make a difference. Thomas had recognized from his own infantilism that most people are emotionally little better than small children. Unlike infantilists, most people they think that their rationalizations for their childish wants and demands are adult in nature. Thomas knew that politicians were aware of this facet of human nature and that they used it instinctively to manipulate the public to increase their power. For that reason, the natural tendency of every democracy was to decline into a patriarchal dictatorship as the politicians veered the ship of state towards a parental role rather than the partnership role that every founder of a democratic state originally intended. Historically, the ancient democracies of Israel, Greece, and Rome sank into kingdoms as the people demanded the right to be relieved of their responsibilities to think and act for themselves. Hitler demolished the budding democratic government in Germany in less than a decade by the same tactics, and Thomas had seen third world countries fall within days to the people's lack of political sophistication. The natural desire to return to childhood rather than embrace the difficult decisions of adulthood had historically destroyed not only individual personalities if left unchecked, but also governments and nations. At least, Thomas mused in his sorrow, an infantilist knew the perils of acting like an infant in an adult world. If an infantilist found a mate who dominated him completely and he disagreed with the situation, then he could get a divorce and walk away. That wasn't true of government or the fictional construct called society. When government decided to take the paternalist approach to its citizens, then they had no choice but to obey or be murdered by the police. An infantilist's emotional need to be mothered or fathered by a real person rather than by a philosophically driven desire to be parented granted them a measure of immunity from the lure of government paternalism. Infantilists as a whole don't deny their feelings and condemn themselves to repeat the mistakes of the past. As Thomas considered the long view of history and the nature of human desire, the instinctive psychic abilities of a baby blossomed in Thomas's mind like a lotus blossom. Suddenly his future unfolded in his mind like petals opening up to reveal the heart of a flower. His ex-wife or mother would never recover from her loss, and she would continue to see him as her baby. Thomas saw his Rolodex watch being taken from his mother's jewelry box per the instructions in her last will and testament and being placed in Mary's hands. Mary would in her turn place his gold wristwatch in her jewelry box. After 5 years, her milk would dry up and she'd put him on formula. Her madness would keep her from taking him to a doctor until he began growing again. By then his fate would be sealed. He'd never regain his continence, nor would he ever be able to talk more than a few baby words. The world would think its most famous scientist had died in an auto crash. Initially, he would be labeled as a mentally challenged child and his inability to speak would be diagnosed as severe retardation. Failure to thrive physically was another symptom of a particular genetic disorder which caused retardation. Further testing wouldn't be necessary in his case. The symptoms would point to a particular disorder and nothing else. He would be medially labeled and put in his slot to await the early death that his doctors predicted. After 10 years, when Thomas began to grow again, Mary would begin to emerge from her illusory world. After a day of weeping and crying over her lost son, she was serendipitously called by one of Thomas's old friends to see how she was doing. When he heard what had happened, he recommended that she see a psychiatrist friend to help her deal with her feelings of grief. After a month of hypnotherapy, she would know what she had to do. She would engage a powerful group of Washington lawyers with connections at the highest levels of government to create a permanent trust in her infant husband's name for the hundreds of billions of dollars that had continued to grow in size as the years had passed. Little did she know that the senior partner of the law firm was the legal advisor to a secret government group codenamed Majestic 12. Until Thomas had matured enough for him to take control of his wealth, Mary arranged for the executors of the trust to see that he would be cared for by a succession of nannies in an isolated house high in the Colorado mountains. Once she saw that her ex-husband baby was properly cared for, she would take her car and run it off the side of a cliff in a fit of depression about her wasted life and lost child. The 1-year-old Thomas would be truly alone in the world except for the nanny who would change his diapers, feed him baby food and nurse him from baby bottles. When each nanny in her turn tired of caring for him, another would be found and then another as decades passed. After Mary died, his gold wristwatch would be carefully secured by the executors of his trust. It would be locked in a safety deposit box deep in the vaults of a soulless, impenetrable bank, never to emerge again. Thomas wailed. Not just for himself, but what he saw coming for his country. The government of America would become a dictatorship of politicians and lawyers. The rich would hire lawyers to construct legally enclosed encastramentations that could not be broached by common man or the IRS. The poor would become poorer as higher education became less reachable. Automation and ultra-high-speed computers with artificial intelligence would replace the lower ranks of the workforce as the 4 gigabit per second processor became commonplace and heuristic self-reprogramming auxiliary job chipsets came into general use for low and medium-priced computers. When the heuristic self-reprogramming auxiliary job chipsets were released, Microsoft Corporation, the largest software company in the world, announced that it intended a new release of Windows 98 with capabilities that far surpassed NT 9.0. The company had reconsidered its OS structure in the light of the new hardware and had decided to resurrect the long-dead Win98 in a new form. They would abandon the monolithic block structure that had been the hallmark of NT's architecture and use the heuristic hardware to create a self-aware OS. According to press releases, Win 10 would reprogram itself on the fly to meet any challenge and construct drivers to match any device that was installed. Aging Bill Gates proudly announced that the beta version had performed flawlessly and had met every test that the programmers could devise.